Hello, APBIO. In this video, I'm going to talk about the origin of species. And I'm actually just going to start from the beginning of the notes because we got to a different place in all three blocks, and I just want to start from the beginning, so I apologize if this is redundant. You should be here in your notes. And the first thing we need to do is define the process. So how does this happen? How do new species form? And the process is actually called speciation, which I think sounds like a word that I made up, but I didn't make it up. It's a word. It's the process. It's the term that refers to the process of one species becoming two species. So what I want you to do first is pause the video. Go to slide number 47 in your Unit 7 Natural Selection class presentation, linked to Moodle, where you are now because you found this flip. And I just want you to watch this quick video. So do that and then come back. Okay, so just like the video tells you in the very end, or states in the very end, that the process of speciation actually requires three different criteria, sort of. The first thing that has to happen, or one thing that has to happen, is the gene pool itself has to be isolated. And then the second thing that has to happen is there has to be some kind of evolutionary change. Those are our evolutionary forces that we talked about the other day. And then there has to be reproductive isolation. So organisms can no longer connect to reproduce. And then speciation can occur. Then there can be one species that turns into two species. And interestingly, the process, if you think about it, really explains both biodiversity and the unity that we see in all living organisms. The biodiversity is because, well, one species is becoming two, so we get more and more. And that's how we have diverse different types of organisms. We call those types species. And also unity. So we have this underlying similarity because the organisms were at one time the same, right? So they're diverging from the same thing, and then two things come from one. So one of the first things we need to do is actually define what a species is. And the term species is defined by what we call the biological species concept. And there are other definitions of species as well, but the biological species concept is the one that's most widely accepted. We'll talk about the other ones in just a second. It was introduced or explained by Mayer in 1942 as a group of individuals whose members can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So they have to actually or potentially interbreed in nature, and not only do they interbreed, but they also have to produce viable, which means living, fertile, which means they are reproductively able, offspring. Now, if you think about that, what it depends on when we're thinking about our allele frequency game changers, it depends on the connection of gene pools. So it depends on gene flow. The gene pools have to be connected in order for them to remain the same species. Now, like I said, I just mentioned, there are issues with there are other definitions of biological species. Because appearance really isn't everything. Organisms might look alike, but they might not necessarily be the same species. So we can't use that. But sometimes in certain cases, it is used. And if we think about this definition right here, one of the significant problems lies right here in this word interbreed. If we think about all of the prokaryotes, they actually don't really interbreed. So now we're ignoring two entire branches of our evolutionary tree of life. So think about that. Think about the prokaryotic and other asexually reproducing organisms. Go to page 504 in your textbook. You may or may not have already read it, but read about some of the problems with the biological species concept, and then about some of the other different definition of species. And then also click on this link here and go to Understanding Evolution. The University of California, Berkeley website's excellent. And just read a little bit about the alternative species concepts. And then pause the video, and then you can come back. Take a little bit of notes right here. This is my quick definitions from the textbook, but I'd also like you to just read this page too. Okay. So like I said, the first thing that has to happen is there has to be gene pool isolation. Two populations have to be isolated from one another. The genes from this population here can't move into this population here. And the mechanisms that, we call them modes of speciation, which is really gene pool isolation. There are certain mechanisms that are going to severely restrict this process of gene flow. And they can be categorized based on whether the place that they're in, quote unquote place. So allopatric refers to, allo means different and patric means place. So whether or not organisms are in the same, are in different places, different geographical locations, we have new species that arise in geographic isolation from the parent species. And if you look at the diagram, you can see here's the original population. There's some kind of a geographic barrier. And then there is reproductive isolation. That's one of the things that we have to have. That's also includes evolutionary change. And then we get two species at the end. So this part that we can't ignore is this part right here. So before we go on, let's look at the other mode of speciation. And just to think about what a mode of speciation means, mode just means like a mode of transportation. I go to the grocery store in my car, but sometimes I walk to the grocery store. It takes a lot longer because I kind of live far from the grocery store. But I also could ride my bike to the grocery store. Those are all modes of transportation. So like the way it happens, the way the getting to the grocery store happens. And this is the way that speciation happens. They either happen in different places, allopatric, or they can happen in the same place. The sympatric, sim meaning same, and again, patric meaning place. Now, this is when new species arise within the same geographic area. So here, if you look at this diagram, you've got the original population. There's some type of gene pool isolation here, and then there's followed by evolutionary change, and then you get a speciation event here, but in the same geographic area. Now, it's not hard to see why this is sort of easier to imagine than this, and we'll get back to that in a minute. But let's first talk about how new species arise when they're in geographic isolation from one another. The next thing that has to happen is there has to be evolutionary change in order to have two different species, because just because they're separated doesn't mean they can't make a baby together. So first thing is easy to see how we'd have allele frequency changes. We have natural selection. We've got two different geographic locations, and there could be different environmental conditions in those two different locations. There's different selective pressures, and then you end up with two organisms that are reproductively isolated because there's been so much change they can no longer make a baby together. The same with genetic drift. We have maybe a small portion of the population is isolated, and then the two species, because the allele frequencies are different, and then there's maybe more natural selection on top of that, those two groups of organisms, these organisms and these organisms, that this is, you know, has a different allele frequency, immediately afterward, there can be mating. But over time, because of the result of the drift together with natural selection, those two different populations can no longer make a baby together, so they fail the basic definition, the biological species concept, and then the two different species. Also because of sexual selection, same thing. And if you look at all these are just allele frequency game changers. This is just evolutionary change. And all these different ways, when those two populations are subjected to different conditions and they're separated from each other, they eventually, over time, can result in not being able to make babies together anymore. And therefore, by definition, there are two different species. Now, let's go over to organisms that are in the same place. How on earth could those become, how can gene pool be restricted when organisms are in the same place? And what can happen is, for example, in plants can tolerate a tremendous amount of polyploidy. So if there's an aneuploid event, if there's incomplete cytokinesis, all of a sudden an organism might have double the amount of chromosomes or might have half the amount of chromosomes. And in that particular case, an organism would be immediately genetically isolated from all of the other members of the species, because when it makes gametes, and then those gametes during sexual reproduction fuse during fertilization, nothing can pair up, and so it wouldn't be fertile, or it wouldn't even be viable. But the thing that's interesting about plants is that many of them are self-fertile. And so what can happen in plants is, if this is Monarda right here, this bee balm, and this, I don't know if Monarda specifically is self-fertile, but if this bee moves the pollen around all the different parts in this flower, which is the sexual organ in the flowering plants, then that plant can have a baby with itself. So it's not genetically isolated from itself. It's genetically isolated from all the other members of its species. So immediately in a polyploid event, you could end up with a brand new species with a different number of chromosomes. So again, that's sympatric speciation. You could get a brand new species in a weird event, or not a weird, in an event where there is a polyploid organism. But that only works for organisms that tolerate polyploidy. The other thing that can happen within a single geographic area, there can be habitat differentiation. And so a portion of the population might switch to a habitat or a food source that's not used by a parent population. Sometimes there's sexual selection. So there's different things about, they're in the same environment, but there's some type of variation in the sexual selection within a population. In fact, there's lots of different interesting ways that organisms can be reproductively isolated within the same geographical area. And what I'd like you to do now is, I'd like you to go to page 502 and 503 in your textbook, because the next, there's an excellent diagram on 502 and 503 in your textbook, and it talks about all the different reproductive barriers that result in reproductive isolation. So how could, like I said, geographic isolation is easy. Okay, duh. That's allopatric speciation, and I can see how those organisms could no longer mate with each other. But what are the ways that organisms can be reproductively isolated from each other within the same environment? And that's what page 502 and 503 does in your textbook. And what I want you to do is, I want you to do it for all the different types. And I've written them here just so you can organize them. Sometimes the isolation is before the zygote forms, and sometimes it's after the zygote forms. So you can put those in your table too, just as a way of thinking about how organisms are going to be reproductively isolated. And then I want you to describe a briefly describe what habitat isolation means, and then come up with a specific example so you could talk about it. So I've done the first one for you so you can see how it is. The table has tons of information in it. Just put it in your own words, and then put in an example here. I'll pause the video so you can have a second to take those notes. And then finally, let's talk about, so now you see the different ways that there can be reproductive isolation. Keep in mind that within the same geographic location, there might be different, what are called hybrid zones. You should just know that there's areas where there's these zones where sort of speciation is on a continuum of occurring, and there might be organisms that maintain the gene pool in those areas, so the organisms will continue to be the same species. But if there are changes that are occurring that are further reproductively isolating organisms, then organisms will go further down the path of speciation. But hybrid zones are sort of the gray area in between species. In any case, we'll finish up the conversation with, how fast does it occur? Okay, so we got this one species becoming two. How fast does it happen? And how does it happen? In terms of what does that look like over time? And there's two different theories about how fast it happens. One is called gradualism, and it's also called Darwinism, because it's what Darwin was talking about. And all that it is slow, gradual change over time. And this is what a picture of it looks like. If we look over here in this diagram, that's what this is showing. So there's changes that are phenotypic changes here, that over time those become more and more and more, and then you end up with two species that are reproductively incompatible, so therefore they are two different species. There's also something, a term called, or the process, the rate is explained by the phrase punctuated equilibrium, which was coined by the scientist Gould I think his name's Stephen. What punctuated equilibrium is this apparent no change, staying the same, apparent stasis that's punctuated. So every once in a while, there's a big change. And if you were to draw a picture of it, it would look like this. Here, this is what this is showing in this diagram. So something really big happens. And then over time, there's this apparent stasis. The stays the same, stays the same. And then there would be another speciation event here. Now, the current theory of the speciation actually is a combination of the two, which is there are these punctuated speciation events where there's significant change, and then there's also gradual change over time. So you can combine these together for this combined idea of the rate of speciation. So just to finish up our conversation and thinking about an overview and what does this speciation, what does it mean? And what is the end, in the end, what occurs? Essentially, what you need to think about is if the definition of species includes this idea that they have to be able to make a baby, then different species, in the end of the process of speciation, the only way two things we know if two things are different species is if they're reproductively incompatible. So that's how we can test to see if different species are two organisms are different species by just looking to see if they can have a baby. So we can mate the two species. So I think you should write that big up here. Different species must be reproductively incompatible by definition, because that's what we're saying down here, that in our definition, they have to be able to interbreed. And if you're a scientist and if you're testing to see if two organisms are different species, the first thing you need to do is mate them and see if they can make viable, fertile offspring. Okay, that's it. I hope that was helpful.